Welcome to the Region Free Gamers podcast. Today we're taking a deep dive into one of our favorite strategy gaming franchises and answering the question, what happened to Advance Wars?
Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Region Free Gamers podcast, the podcast that is fluent in gaming. My name is Arnie and I'll be taking over hosting duties today. As always, please remember to follow us on iTunes, YouTube, or any of your other favorite podcast apps. Leave us a rating and review when you can, and don't forget to pick up and powerbomb through a table that subscribe button and then hit it with the people's elbow just for good measure. Before we dig into today's topic, let me introduce you to my lone co-host for this episode, hailing from the Great White North, Paul.
Hey, my name's Paul. I like video games.
Yeah, so just one co-host today. We got two region-free gamers, technically not region-locked, thanks to Paul's decision to live abroad. And so we're trying a little something different today, so I hope that you all enjoy what will be either a great success or a complete dumpster fire of an episode. We'll find out in short order.
Dumpster fire.
So with that out of the way, let's move on to today's topic, which is Advanced Wars. So Advanced Wars is somewhat of a interesting series to cover. It's very long and very storied. It was part of the larger Wars franchise, which started with Famicom Wars. It was developed by Intelligent Systems, who you may know of Fire Emblem fame. And Famicom Wars was their original release for the series, released on August 12th of 1988, exclusively in Japan. Much like Fire Emblem, it has received various releases that were Japan exclusives before it ever transitioned to a worldwide series. So there are quite a few. There's Famicom Wars, obviously. There's Game Boy Wars. There's Game Boy Wars Turbo. There's Super Famicom Wars, which I think might be the most well-known of the international releases. Game Boy Wars 2 and Game Boy Wars 3. And then finally, we got Advance Wars. The series was originally not planned to be released outside of Japan, allegedly because Nintendo thought that consumers outside of Japan would not be interested in turn-based games.
Which, by the way, is my favorite, secret racist thing about this series, is the Japanese being I like how when we're doing research on it, they found every single way to phrase it except for the Japanese thought Americans were too dumb.
Yes.
But, which is really what it comes down to.
Correct. So
in their defense, you were going to say?
Well, I was just going to say, in their defense, what were the favorite gaming genres of the time in America? I think, FPSs were big.
FPSs?
Wasn't it? In, the early 2000s?
Okay.
I'm talking about when Advance Wars finally released. Yes, back in the day.
Yeah, no, I was thinking the Famicom era, and
yeah, it would have been platformers.
And when you said FPS, I was like, in the 80s?
No, it would have been platformers. But yeah, I think that the sort of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest sort of genre was still hanging over Americans' heads, where Japanese developers were just you gotta make the games easier, or sometimes you gotta make them harder. I know there's Contra Hardcore was one of those where the game is actually harder in the West than it is in Japan.
Oh man. And it's funny you bring up Mystic Quest, because it's hey, we want to get Americans into RPGs, let's release the shittiest one we can. Right? This will work wonders.
It's just let's release an RPG that you can't lose.
Anyhow.
Oh Lord. But so as part of that whole sort of thought process, when Advance Wars finally did release, it released with what has to be one of the most in-depth tutorials ever. It was sort of designed so you wouldn't even have to read the manual when you got the game. But I did want to ask you, Paul, what was your first experience with Advance Wars?
You know, my first experience actually playing Advanced Wars was Dual Strike on the DS. I remember seeing Advanced Wars, and I remember seeing Advanced Wars Black Hole Rising. And it's not that I didn't have a Game Boy Advance. I did buy one eventually when the SP model was released. I needed two things in order to make that purchase. I needed an SP, because I didn't like the original form factor, and I needed Final Fantasy Tactics to be released on it.
Gotcha.
And once those two things came together, I bit the bullet and I got the system. And Advance Wars was always on the radar, but it just never happened. And so it didn't make my eventual, meager collection of Game Boy Advance games.
Well, I wanted to ask you, like, what was your impression of it? Because like you said, I know you've played Final Fantasy Tactics before. So you had some experience with turn-based tactical games, which I think Advance Wars was supposed to be an introduction to people to that genre. And so as somebody who's already had some experience with that, I was wondering, like, was Advance Wars sort of like a dumbed down version of what you had experienced before?
No. See, Advance Wars to me, okay, so we have to go back in time a little bit.
Yeah.
To me, what Advance Wars most resembles actually isn't Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem has a focus on relationship building and getting bonuses that way, right?
Yeah.
And the actual strategy part of it is, I don't want to call it fairly light, but it's just different, right? Experience carries over from battle to battle, which doesn't happen in Advance Wars. The closest analog to Advance Wars, from my memory, and, for the one person who's going to remember this, Military Madness on the TurboGrafx.
Interesting.
Yeah, which was eventually re-released as Nectaris on the PlayStation. And for the record, Nectaris on the PlayStation, borderline unplayable because of the loading times. Like, oh my god, I remember picking it up thinking, cool, like an updated Military Madness. And then I'd sit there and eat my sandwich waiting for the other screens to load, and I'm like, this is horrendous. But I digress. So yeah, the closest thing, Military Madness, because every level is its own self-contained thing, stats and bonuses and all that. Nothing carries over from level to level. And you have multiple... I should actually, know what? Fire Emblem also has multiple paths to victory in that you can seize a throne or whatever.
Yeah.
But in Advance Wars, it's a little bit more like... There's a little bit more of a focus on the multiple paths to completion. Like, I find in Fire Emblem, if you're doing a scenario where you can either seize the throne or kill everybody, I usually just kill everybody anyway.
Yeah.
Because you're looking for the XP, right? Whereas in Advance Wars, there is no XP bonus for doing that kind of stuff. And in Dual Strike, you actually get bonuses for completing a level faster.
Yeah.
So it behooves you to actually cut right through the enemy and go for that headquarters and take it.
Yeah.
So this is just like a really long answer to your question, right? Like, it most resembles Military Madness, and Dual Strike, dude, I loved it. Loved it. And I didn't think it was dumbed down at all. It's just different.
Yeah. Yeah, because for me, I had never played a strategy RPG before I played Advance Wars. I believe Advance Wars was my first one. I got it near release on my clear purple Game Boy Advance, because everything had to be clear. It was the best color. The best color.
Yeah, man. Grapes, yo.
And so... It was great for me because it sort of introduced me to all these concepts in a very like easy to understand way. And playing it prior to Fire Emblem, Advance Wars is really to me just a much more pure form of what a strategy RPG should be, because it doesn't have permadeath. And so I don't have to, I don't develop attachments to my units. I develop attachment to my commanding officer. And I don't have to worry about, am I going to send these units in or these units? And one of the other things that I really like about it is that in Fire Emblem and a lot of these games, I think Shining Force is another turn-based sort of series from back in the day where you get a pre-loadout of units. So you get, it's like, here's your units and you have to use them to win. And so it sort of bases its strategy around how well can you manage your existing resources. Whereas Advance Wars says, here's some units, but then here's facilities to produce more units. And so it's really a situation where, like you said, it rewards thinking outside the box in terms of you could just go out and try to kill everybody, but that might result in like a long, dragged out sort of conflict where your opponent keeps producing units, you keep producing units, none of you can really get a foothold into the other's sort of territory to take over more cities to help you produce more resources to produce more units, or you could sort of try to snake around your opponent and take their headquarters and just end the fight outright. So it's sort of two sides of the same coin. But Advance Wars to me is much more like, you know, I don't have to worry about a story or, you know, have to develop sort of bonds with individual characters. And this all makes it sound like I'm just trying to you know, not give a shit about other people in my game, which is not true, but I think it provides a different kind of entertainment. It's more of a pick up and play sort of experience, you don't have to get super invested sort of experience. And I think there's value to that. I think that Advance Wars sort of scratches a different itch as far as strategy games go.
Yeah, 100%. It's exactly like you said, like each level being self-contained. The battles aren't quite as long, though they can be. But that's something I'll get to later, when we talk about Dual Strike. But yeah, I definitely think there's value in that over something like Fire Emblem. And, you know, to be clear, we're not pooping on Fire Emblem here.
Yes.
I've been playing Fire Emblem all year this year on the 3DS, in some way, shape, or form. So, hey, you know, much love to that.
Yeah.
But Advance Wars, you know, it's its own thing.
Absolutely. And so with that, I think that we're just going to dive right into the first Advance Wars, simply titled Advance Wars. So Advance Wars released on what is probably the worst release date for any game ever. September 10th of 2001. I'm sure the marketing team was red-faced for several weeks. And so originally there were plans to release the game in PAL territories and Japan slightly later than this date, but obviously due to the events of September 11th, 2001, both of those releases were promptly delayed. PAL territories did get it in January 11th of 2002, and Japan didn't end up seeing Advance Wars 1 or 2 until they got a compilation cart of both games in 2004. So Japan, interestingly enough, sort of got the short end of the stick with Advance Wars, even though they've actually had a history with this series for years.
Completely bizarre. I remember reading that because I didn't know about that until we were researching this episode. Mm-hmm. And I remember reading that. And honestly, like, I thought it was like a typo or something.
Yeah.
I'm like, how on earth did Japan not get this game until 3 years later? Like, I get the timing with the attack on September 11th, but holy crap, man. It's completely backwards from how all this kind of stuff was historically.
Yeah, it really is. And it's interesting because there's no reason for me to feel this way, but it sort of makes me feel like Advance Wars is more our thing. You know what I mean? Like,
oh yeah,
like the War series in general, definitely squarely Japan, but I feel like Advance Wars, by virtue of us getting it and getting the second game before even they did, I feel like feels much more of a Western series to me now. And
well, I mean, it is, right? We'll get to why later.
Yes.
But it is absolutely more of a Western focused property at this point.
Yes. And very, very heavily Western inspired, as we'll see.
Yes.
But just to talk a little bit about the credits, so you got the director, Toru Narihiro, who is a longtime intelligence systems employee, I believe, who has been a main producer on both Advance Wars and Fire Emblem. So this guy is like strategy RPG king, of the world, I think.
Yeah.
Produced by Takahiro Izushi. He's worked on Pokemon, worked on Fire Emblem, Metroid Fusion, which makes him like honorary God King in my eyes, because I love that game. And Sin and Punishment on the N64. So very nice resume, of stuff that I like and probably like 10 other people like. All those things in order. Music composed by Taishi Senda, who I want to give a special shout out to because I didn't really remember what Advance Wars' soundtrack was like, so I ended up listening to most of it in the run up to recording this episode, and that is really good, like Game Boy Advance music. And I know there's, like, listening to it on my computer as opposed to listening to it through, like, the tiny, tinny speaker on a original Game Boy Advance, I'm sure is completely different. But it's very, like, it's very interesting and, like, very much captures the feel of, like, it's time to, like, go to battle and, like, let's do this, you know? It's very, like, hoorah, like, very heavily guitar-laden, like, nice drums. The only problem is that missions in Advance Wars can range anywhere from like 2 minutes to like an hour. So these compositions are not made to like hold you over that long. So some of the longer missions could get a little repetitive. And then he is also credited with tracks on Paper Mario, which I love. And nobody seems to know where he is. He's not currently in video games anymore, which is, I always find fascinating when like somebody who's done a game that I really like, and then there's like, and he was never heard from again.
It's crazy. Like, I mean, you know, people in regular industries, people in non-video game industries. I mean, what's regular really? You know, they have career changes all the time, right?
Yeah.
But somehow when it's anybody to do with video games and I read about them just vanishing, I'm always fascinated.
Yes.
Absolutely fascinated. I'm like, what could they be doing? Where did they go?
I think that's mostly because I envision them like just telling everybody that they like did something for video games at all times. Just in casual
like
conversation.
They're a pilot.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey Arnie, how do you know there's a video game programmer at a party?
Oh my god, how?
They'll tell you.
Oh my god. This episode is canceled. We're scrapping the whole thing. Oh Lord.
Anyhow.
But yeah, so if anybody knows where Taishi Senda is, please tell me, because I need to know now. So actually moving into the meat of the game. So the game is divided into 5 nations. Orange Star, Blue Moon, Yellow Comet, Green Earth, and Black Hole. And I think you should be sensing a pattern right about now. With colors and shapes. Or astral bodies, I guess. Yeah. But so Orange Star, which is known as Red Star in Japan, but was changed to Orange Star in the West for potentially obvious reasons. It was to avoid comparisons to like communist Russia and things of that nature, I believe. But in a sort of ironic twist, I think they are the country that is modeled after the United States. So in Advance Wars, what you'll notice is that each unit from every nation is sort of modeled slightly differently from other nations, and they're all based on existing national forces here on the planet Earth, obviously. But so with Orange Star, you have the U.S. Armed Forces, with your commanding officers Andy, Max, and Sammy, who are your sort of main protagonists throughout the whole of Advance Wars 1, and you have their commanding officer Nell, who is playable character, but you don't really play her throughout the story. Mm-hmm. Then you have Blue Moon, which is modeled after Russia and the Soviet Union, led by General Olaf and Grit, who are former Orange Star commanding officers. I sort of always saw that connection when I was playing Advance Wars, that like these are armies that are modeled after certain countries. But not until I read through like some of this information where they think these armies are based on, did it actually start like clicking in my head. Cause like as a kid, I feel like you don't think about that stuff very much.
Yeah. I didn't notice at all.
Yeah.
The only one that I really noticed, because I mean you get bludgeoned with it, is Black Hole.
Yes. But I thought that was kind of cool. Like when I finally noticed it, I was like, oh, this adds like a new dimension. I like that they were like, when they were designing these sort of armies, they took inspiration from sort of different countries, and they took the time to make these units different. You know,
Yes.
like I feel like it would have been just as acceptable to make the same units in different colors and nobody would have actually cared. But they took the time to sort of change the look and feel of some of these. So then you have Yellow Comet. And so Yellow Comet is led by Kanbei, who's the emperor of the Yellow Comet Nation, and his daughter Sonia. And then you have, I think, my personal favorite nation, which is Green Earth. They're originally modeled after Germany in Super Famicom Wars. In Advance Wars 1 and 2, they're modeled more closely after Great Britain. And this was one that when I was like going through it in my head, I was like, oh yeah, Yellow Comet this, like Blue Moon that. What the hell is Green Earth? And then when I read it, I was like, oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
And it's also, this is my favorite fun fact about this entire series, is that the two Green Earth commanding officers are Eagle and Drake, who are modeled after Germany's Red Baron and Britain's Sir Francis Drake, which I love because they're like, Eagle is focused on air combat, which makes complete sense, and then Drake is modeled after naval combat. And it's like those little things that when I hear a fact like this, I often wonder to myself, like, is this a thing that they actually did on purpose, or is this a thing that sort of fans are attributing to them after the fact because it makes sense?
Yeah.
And then you have your antagonists in Black Hole. They are led by General Sturm, and obviously, as Paul was saying, it's a very clear Nazi Germany parallel to Black Hole.
Big time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like in the design of the characters and, you know, just the general way I think that they go about waging war.
Yeah. No, every other country or army, rather, whatever you want to call them, they all went right over my head. Like it was just like, these are the colors, these are the characters. I had no idea that there was any analog to real life.
Yeah.
But man, that Black Hole could not be more Nazi Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. And so basically what happens, so the story of Advance Wars, as far as there is a story, because it's essentially the same story for 2 to 3 games, depending on how you look at it. But in Advance Wars 1, you assume control of the Orange Star Army. Initially, you can only play as Andy, but you'll shortly be able to unlock Max and Sammy as playable characters just as you progress through the missions. And I believe, I don't know if they'd let you do this in Advance Wars 1, but I believe they do, is you have a choice. There are certain missions where you can play as several different characters, so the game lets you choose which character you want to play as. The main difference being that each commanding officer provides several passive buffs or debuffs to their units, and also have different commander powers, which they can use at different points during combat. There are a total of 11 playable commanding officers, but you can only play as them in versus mode. In the story mode, you are only allowed to play as Andy, Max, or Sammy, because you follow Orange Star's story throughout, the campaign, which essentially boils down to what every Advance Wars game boils down to: liberate every country and then defeat Black Hole in some insane final mission that'll take you like 2 hours. And basically the story is, here's the thing, is that I feel like when you play something like Shining Force or Fire Emblem or Final Fantasy Tactics, and you experience these very intricate, well-designed, involved, any other superlative I can come up with, story for these games, with all these characters that you sort of become involved with and that you grow to like and appreciate. Advance Wars story, by contrast, is like the most bare bones sort of story, like military story that you could possibly tell.
Yeah. And I don't even know if that's good or not, right?
That's what I'm saying. Like, I don't know what to think of it.
Because the game, I think if the game itself was weaker, it would be really bad. Because then you'd have a crappy game with a crappy story. Yeah. And we wouldn't be doing a podcast about it. But when you have something like Advance Wars, which lends itself to fairly quick fights, I'm good with it, man. I don't really need a big story for a military strategy game. Yeah. Like, as a general rule, all these kind of military or I shouldn't say all, but like as a general rule, a lot of these military strategy games are based on the real world, right? Like the old Panzer General, from SSI and all these other old military strategy games, or, like Iron Storm on the Sega Saturn based on the Daisenryaku series in Japan. Like, these are all based on World War II or World War I, or some kind of real life, thing, right? Yeah. In which case, what story is there, right? Like, the story is the game. And so Advance Wars, I think, is similar in that there's not much of a need for a story there. Like, everything is about the gameplay. And I don't necessarily think the game suffers for having such a bare bones, orange versus yellow, and that's about it. Yeah.
And just to quickly go over the story, essentially, Andy is framed as having attacked other nations, and so all the nations turn on Orange Star, you take control of Orange Star, you liberate all the other nations, basically convince them that you're not evil. You then find out that Andy has a doppelganger that is being controlled by Black Hole, and so then you join forces to take on Black Hole, and you either win or you turn the game off at the last mission and don't play it again for 10 years. Not that I've experienced that myself.
Oh, no.
It's just so hard. There's like, you have to control like 3 different commanding officers, and Sturm has like a giant gun that like shoots the crap out of you, or he uses his co-power or something and it like destroys you. It's very much like just throw units at the wall until you eventually win. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so gameplay, like Paul said, gameplay is where the game excels, and where I think if you're a fan of strategy RPGs, even if you're not, I think that Advance Wars might be something that people would want to play. It's basic, when you're in the campaign, it's usually involves just 2 commanding officers battling it out. I think versus mode you can go up to 4. And basically you battle out using whatever units you're initially provided in your scenario. And then some maps, like we discussed before, provide specific buildings that create units for you. It's not worth discussing in detail how everything works. Essentially, the main difference between Advance Wars and other strategy RPGs of the time is you basically have to control territory. Controlling territory is how you sort of build up your army. So the more cities you control, the more money you produce, the more units you can create. Units obviously differing in price based on what they are and stuff like that. One thing that I thought that Advance Wars did that I had never seen before, and I feel like I haven't really seen since to like such a well-crafted degree, is the division of units. So there are sea units, there are air units, and there are ground units. And each of these units sort of interact in different ways. Some air units can't attack ground or sea troops. Some sea units can't attack air or ground troops. And so it's really, you have to strategize what units are good for what situation. And much like actual war, some units are specifically good against other units. Meaning that even if you're at a numbers disadvantage, you can still win because your unit is just that much better than the other person's unit.
Yeah, and that whole interplay is the backbone of the game.
Yeah.
Like, you can take a series like Fire Emblem where you can equip weapons that are strong against certain types of units and kind of get an idea of what that is like for Advance Wars. But in Advance Wars, it's like that, but multiplied by 5.
Yeah.
Because every single unit has its strengths and weaknesses, and how you deploy them and how you protect them, really, really is the backbone of the game.
Yeah. And Advance Wars, I feel like, is a perfect example of easy to learn, difficult to master. Because there are just things that iterate upon things. For example, you could have a specific unit. That unit has strengths and weaknesses. That unit also has ammo and fuel that you have to worry about. That unit also has specific tiles that they could be on that might grant you more defense or might hide you in fog of war. You know, so there's all these little things that sort of go into it, but when you're actually playing, it sort of comes naturally to you, where you're like, I want this unit because I know they have this unit. And so, you know, you sort of just figure out in your mind, like, this unit can move this many spaces, and then I can resupply it here, and then I can put it in the forest so they can't see it in the fog of war. You know, it's like something that, like, you're thinking in your mind, but when you're actually playing, it just seems like second nature, because all these things are introduced very gradually, which is like a thing that I think Advance Wars does really, really well. Like I said, when they first released the first game, they had such an in-depth tutorial that was just dedicated to showing you every single thing, but then it's not like they go through all that and then they just throw you into a mission where you have to do all of that at once. They still have a progression of missions building up to more complicated scenarios. And so I think it's very successful in sort of making you feel like a military genius, even when you might not be.
Well, it's very intuitive, and it doesn't hurt that, first of all, the UI is really good.
Yes.
Everything can be done very quickly, and the graphics, even like, and this is a Game Boy Advance game, like, it's not a big screen by any stretch, but all of the units are very distinctive, and the colors are all very different and bright. The cartoony style really helps as well.
Yeah.
Because you don't have to, like, for tanks, you know, they don't have to worry about, you know, a lot of detail. They don't have to worry about accuracy. They can just draw this, you know, these different cartoony tanks, and you can tell which one each is just instantly looking at them.
Yeah.
It's very, very clever.
Yeah. I mean, and I think going back to what you mentioned, which we haven't talked about somehow, is the art style in Advance Wars, I think might be some of my favorite on the system. It's just like, first of all, it's anime as hell.
Sure.
Clearly. But it's done, like you said, in just this sort of kind of simplistic style where it just makes everything look very, very good. Because it's not like overly muddled. It's not muddied by having such a small screen because the designs are very straightforward. But it uses such bright colors that I think, honestly, playing this on like an original Game Boy Advance was probably some kind of crime, because you don't really, until the SP with the backlit screen comes out, you don't really see like the depth of color that is in like some of these designs. It's really like quite beautiful.
Yep. And it also manages to be very anime and cartoony, but without being juvenile.
Yes.
Right? It looks, I don't want to say it looks adult, but it doesn't look kiddie.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Which I think is important when you're doing a game about war, you know, because ultimately, like, you see these units like blow each other up and like shoot each other. And so I think like that sort of fine line, like you said, like being approachable without being overly childish or overly simplistic, I think is like sort of a very hard thing to navigate. And I think they nailed it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they nailed it. And to this day, it's still very distinctive. Funnily enough, a close analog would be the new Fire Emblem games on the 3DS. Mm-hmm. They just have a very pleasing and distinct art style, I find.
Yeah.
And I think that that's borrowed from Advance Wars, which is very, very similar. And I mean, obviously the same company, right? So, you know.
Yeah. And one of the other things that I want to touch on is the fact that, you know, you have this game that has sort of this hidden complexity to it and sort of this breadth of stuff that you can do and all these little intricacies that make it very interesting. But you're also talking about a handheld game on a machine that has 4 buttons, if you don't count select and start, and is basically a souped up Super Nintendo. And I feel like it just, even amongst like the games of the time, it felt like a game that looked great and played great for being on such a small console. And I feel like Advance Wars, along with games like Golden Sun and Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, were games that, for me at least, finally made it so I was like, the line between portable and console began to get a little blurred, in the sense that before this, whenever I played a portable game, with maybe the exception of Pokemon, I was like, oh, I can tell why this was on the Game Boy. Like, you can tell that this is a little more limited. It's not as big in scope. It's not necessarily ambitious, because there were ambitious games on handhelds, but it's not like the line between what is a console game and what is a handheld game, I feel like was much clearer before a lot of these games on the Game Boy Advance started coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially because the Game Boy Advance was released during a time where, you know, the 16-bit era was, you know, it was pretty well and long dead at that point.
Yeah.
But with that said, like, strategy, you know, like something like Advance Wars, mechanically, if you release this game on the PlayStation 2, it's not going to be a hell of a lot different other than the visuals and sound.
Yeah.
Mechanically, the depth of gameplay and the control scheme, I mean, you've got 4 more buttons, but what for, right?
Yep.
So it's a game that could have been released on a 32-bit or, you know, 128 whatever bit system. But aside from the visuals, is going to be pretty much the same game. So you're getting, you know, a complex, deep gaming experience on a portable, the likes that you haven't seen before. And it's pretty much blurred the line, like you said, right?
Yep. And, you know, not to get too bogged down in mechanics, but I just want to touch on a couple other things that I thought were really cool for this game. One is that it had weather effect, singular, because it had one other weather. Actually, that's not true. It had 2. There's rain and there's snow. And again, like, these weather effects, like, have an effect on your units and how you fight. Rain decreases movement for only tread and tire units in specific tiles. So, like, in woods and in plains, which are like grass. Which makes sense. When it rains, it gets muddy, and your tanks don't move as well, your Jeeps don't move as well, anything that has tires doesn't move as well. And that sort of stuff is, as a kid, like, I had no idea, because I don't think you realize unless you're looking for it, but it's so, like, it's just, like, Advance Wars is a game that does a lot of little things well, overall. Like, there's just a bunch of little things that when you think about it, it's like, this didn't need to be in this game at all, but the fact that it is makes it a lot more impressive.
Yeah, and without bogging it down.
Yes. Yeah, it's not something that's like sort of obstructs gameplay in any way. If you're not like strategic enough that you don't account for stuff like that, like it'll never, like when I was a kid, I just made whatever units I wanted and I didn't worry about anything. And I still had fun, and obviously sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. But I always found it enjoyable. So I don't know. Advance Wars is one that's close to my heart. And for the first one, so like we talked about before, there's 2 ways to win, destroying all opponents or capturing, headquarters. You can only capture units with your infantry or your mech units, not robots. They're just like bazooka, toting dudes. Again, completely makes sense. Like, you'd send your infantry in to capture cities, capture locations in actual war. And then, we touched on this briefly, but every commanding officer has advantages and disadvantages, and they have commanding officer powers. And basically what these are, and this is, I think, a complete left turn from anything that I've seen in strategy games, is that you have, like, this one power that can sort of shift the tide of war in one way or the other, but your opponent also has their own power. So it's not like you're the chosen one, you get this special thing that helps you. It's still a thing that you have to know how to use strategically, because your opponent also has it. Now that I think about it, I think that's kind of what I like about Advance Wars, is that, like, you're not special. You know what I mean? Like, you are 100%. Just a regular other person who can do these things, but other people can also do them. You're not the chosen one. Like, you don't stand above everybody else. It's very much like Average Joe, the war simulator. So I like that. And I think a lot of other people did, because despite its unfortunate release date, this game received universal acclaim. It has a Metacritic score of 92. 2 fun facts about Advance Wars, like, just acclaim over the years. The first, and one that I really enjoy, is that Edge Magazine initially rated Advance Wars 9 out of 10 in 2001 when it came out, but in 2013 retroactively changed their score to a 10 out of 10, which made it like one of, I think, like 26 games that got a perfect score from Edge Magazine.
Yeah.
But also the fact that they retroactively changed the score, like, that was weird to me. I was like,
I know, right? My bad.
Yeah.
You know, this game is actually perfect.
Exactly.
It's taken me 12 years to figure it out, but 9's just not good enough. This game's amazing.
I did want to highlight a review for Advance Wars that I saw on Metacritic. So maybe this could be the second episode of the Region Free Gamers dramatic reading theater. I don't know if you want to put a soaring score behind me.
I can do the nasally nerd voice here very easily.
Oh my god, please.
Because that's exactly what this person is. So this person gave Advance Wars a 4 out of 10, which is unconscionable. That I don't understand why you're even writing a review at that point. I don't want to be, like, a negative guy here.
Yeah.
But holy shit, man. 4 out of 10 for this game? Not to say that this game isn't good, because it is.
Which immediately blows my mind.
Right? Because 4 out of 10 means it's a terrible game.
Correct.
But it's good, I swear. I just don't think it's fair it gets all the love it does. Why? Because nearly everything is ripped straight out of Fire Emblem. People think that Fire Emblem was ripped for Advance Wars because Advance Wars came out in 2001, while Fire Emblem came out in 2004. However, Fire Emblem came first, because Fire Emblem had been running strong in Japan since 1990.
Which, again, is doubly weird because of the fact that clearly he knows his Fire Emblem history, and you would think that he would know his Advance Wars history enough to know that Famicom Wars came out in 1988.
Also, by the way, capital letters, who the fuck cares? Right? It doesn't matter. The game is amazing, okay? Take your 4 out of 10 and take it back to your mom's basement, dude. It's such a terrible review. And I mean, it's funny that we're devoting like a full 60 seconds to ripping on like random dudes. He's not part of any publication, not a journalist.
This one was too much for me. Just because he says that the game is good in the first sentence of this review.
I know. And then it's all ripped. And the funny thing is, too, is that virtually none of the mechanics are taken from Fire Emblem.
No.
It's a strategy game, right? That is where the similarities end.
Correct. So that was just something that I had to write that down. I was blown away when I read it.
Oh, super, super happy you found that.
Yes. Also, this is when I first discovered that EGM does very, very specific ratings, since they rated it 7.33 out of 10. And this is like a thing that they do throughout all the reviews I've seen of theirs. They do like very decimal heavy reviews.
Is EGM still around? I think they're not, right?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Yeah. All right. This is all coming together now.
Anybody who dares raise a hand against Advance Wars is swiftly destroyed. But so overall, I think that we've given people an idea of what we think of Advance Wars. I don't think we're sort of trying to fucking hide the ball here. But what do you think, Paul? Like overall, Advance Wars, like has it aged well, and what do you think of it in general?
Honestly, I think the Edge magazine, that whole thing kind of proves the point, right? Like the gameplay, this gameplay hasn't changed much over the years, and it doesn't have to. It's always going to be good. Yeah. Right? So when you go back and you play Advance Wars, you have these charming visuals, you have the charming bit-tune music. I think it's aged fine. I'm happy to go back and play it again if presented with the opportunity. Yeah,
I think I completely agree. Like, I think it is a game that has not evolved a lot, at least until...
But it doesn't need to.
Exactly.
Right? Like, yeah.
But I think it speaks to the fact that, like, if you go back to Advance Wars now, like, if you look at some of the contemporary... strategy RPGs that were inspired by Advance Wars, they're still kind of doing the same thing. Like, like it's not like you go back to Advance Wars and it's sort of outdated in what it was doing. I don't necessarily think it was revolutionary at the time, but it's just one of those sort of mechanical styles that are just sort of timeless. Like, it still plays fine. It still delivers on what it sets out to do, which is give you some fun sort of strategy levels to play through, you know, in a very like entertaining and lighthearted way. It's sort of like Advance Wars to me, like whenever I play a level of it, it just seems like it's a puzzle, you know, like it's a little puzzle game. Like, how am I gonna sort of attack this problem this time and sort of figure everything out? And I think that stuff just stays timeless to a certain degree.
Yep. No, I fully agree.
All right. So, we're going to take a small break, and then we're going to come back and talk about Advance Wars 2 Black Hole Rising. So stick around, guys. Welcome back. Time for Advance Wars 2 Black Hole Rising. Alright, so this game I have a little bit more mixed feelings about, I think. But it was released in the US on June 24th of 2003, so they avoided another national disaster in their release schedule, thank God.
Way to go, guys.
And obviously direct sequel to the first Advance Wars game. Or I should say, the first Advance Wars, because it's the first one on the Game Boy Advance. The European release was October 3rd of 2003, and as we've already discussed, there was no Japanese release until 2004. So, it's crazy that not only did they not get the first one, they didn't get the second one until a year after it had already come out in America and Europe. Again, just insane to me that this would happen. I know it's not the first time something like this has happened, but it's weird to read, especially about
really
a Nintendo game.
Yeah.
Directing duties were taken over by Makoto Shimojo. Obviously, again, another fantastic Intelligent Systems employee who's worked on several Advance Wars and Fire Emblem games in multiple capacities. Intelligent Systems kind of reminds me of Nihon Falcom, who we did an episode on a while ago, in that it's like this little company where people just seem to like take whatever role is assigned to them. for like all these amazing games. So they have their names like in all sorts of places.
Yeah.
This time, director of the first Advance Wars game, Toru Narihiro, is producing, and it was composed by Yoshito Hirano. I'm gonna butcher these names.
Nah, you nailed that one. We're all good.
He composed music for Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door. Excellent game. Codename Steam, which I haven't played. And of course, Advance Wars and Fire Emblem. The soundtrack for Advance Wars 2 feels like it hits some of the same beats as Advance Wars 1, but it feels a lot more complex. Because there's a lot more instruments that are being used now, a lot more brass, a lot more, I feel like drums are much more prominent. It's not as guitar heavy as Advance Wars 1 was. So it's still really good. Again, I'm sure through the baked potato that was the speaker for the Game Boy Advance, it didn't sound nearly as good as it deserved to sound. But serviceable for what it's doing. We see the addition of 8 new commanding officers on top of all the returning ones from Advanced Wars. So we're up to 19 playable commanding officers in other modes outside of the campaign. And this is something that we'll see, is that Advanced Wars does not skimp out on the content, specifically when it comes to playable characters.
Yep.
Which I love, because the more variety you give people, especially in strategy games, when the commanding officers just aren't like a placeholder or like your avatar, they actually contribute to your strategy and the way you fight, I think is great.
Oh yeah, the replay value because of all the multiple COs, and especially in Dual Strike. We'll get to Dual Strike, but like the replay value just increases so much, and it's, you just don't get bored of it, really.
So now that you've said it, I want to take a quick digression into, how do you pronounce C? Like, you just say CO? Is that how you like?
Yeah, I just say CO.
Okay, because when I read it, like when I was a kid, I always just said co. Like when I was reading, and so I was like, I know it's like commanding officer. So is it co? Is it CO? I'm just gonna say the word so I don't get in trouble. But one thing they did change is they added commanding officer superpowers, which are more powerful versions of their original powers. So now you have a longer gauge, and the gauge is affected by several things. Basically, how many units you destroy, how many units of yours the opponent destroys, things of that nature affect how quickly or how slowly your gauge fills. And I think specific commanding officers have faster filling gauges than others, just in general, based on what their powers are. And here we come to the crux of the issue with Advance Wars 2, is that Advance Wars 2 changed virtually nothing from Advance Wars 1, to the point that only one new unit was added. And I think the impasse here is, do you care? In the sense that, like, it doesn't really change anything, but it does everything that Advance Wars did still is right. It still feels good. It still plays very well. And so a lot of people see Advance Wars 2 as more of an expansion pack or a sort of map pack to Advance Wars 1, because there's not really a big change from one game to the other.
It's hard to say. It's hard to say whether, like how much, and you'll see it with Dual Strike. Yep. Dual Strike takes a larger leap forward.
Yes.
But if Dual Strike only had one screen, maybe not, right? Mm-hmm. But that's a whole other ball of wax. I mean, look, if it was a crappy game, I would care more.
Yeah.
But because it's Advance Wars and it was such a good, it was so good the first time, I'm kind of on the side of forgiving them.
Yeah.
Like, look, it was released 2 years later, right? And we've been raking Electronic Arts over the coals for years, for releasing the same Madden game every year, so to speak, right? So this practice, not necessarily unheard of, kind of accepted. And in the case of Advance Wars, it was a couple years later, right? So I don't know. I'm good with it. I can see why people might have been expecting a little more, but I don't know. I think with the Game Boy Advance, there's really only so much advancement, that we can that we can do here. One new unit, seems a little lazy, but it's still a great game.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not gonna hide my bias here. I love Advance Wars, and so for me, having more Advance Wars was reason enough to buy this game. It really is just that simple for me. It's like, I like Advance Wars. I want more Advance Wars. I'm gonna buy Advance Wars too. And it's funny because I know I've said it a whole bunch in that, like Persona 5, how many sentences have started like that? But it's true for me that they evolve just enough. They take what's good and they make it better. And I think Advance Wars 2 sort of does something similar. They don't try to change everything. They don't try to sort of give you a brand new experience when they know that you already enjoyed the experience they gave you the first time. Yeah. There's a new unit.
I think... Mm-hmm. No, I think where it suffers is in the fact that, look, when you're playing a game for the first time that has mechanics that you've never seen before, that is the best kind of gaming experience in general that you can have, right? Yeah. So, you have a lot of these kids or teenagers, whatever, who have a Game Boy Advance, and then they're given a game like Advance Wars, and they've never played a game like Advance Wars, and everything is fresh, and you remember that experience. And so when Advance Wars 2 comes out, it's impossible to have that same experience again. Yeah. Right? It's just expanding on the first time. So when you're going through the tutorial missions, there's kind of this, been here, done that. Let's get the tutorial done. And a lot of the strategies that you employed from the first game are going to be the same. You've got new maps, you've got new COs, and that throws a wrinkle into it. It throws, you're figuring out some new problems, but you've already kind of figured out the fundamentals. Yeah. And so, by that token, it can't be the same experience. It doesn't mean that it's a bad game per se, but it's hurt by that lack of novelty compared to the first one.
Absolutely. And the story isn't doing it any favors in that department. It follows directly from the first one. Black Hole returns. Dun dun dun. Under leadership of Sturm, who is now accompanied by several Black Hole COs. So this is like half of your new COs right here, is these new Black Hole COs, that are attempting to once again capture the Allied nations. One thing that the Advance Wars 2 did that speaks to what you were saying about replayability is that you can select missions non-linearly. So you're no longer just going from mission to mission. There are points where more than one mission will open up and you have to decide, which mission you're going to and what order you want to tackle them in, which I found really nice because if I ever got stuck on a mission, I wasn't stuck on a mission. I could go do other missions.
Yeah. It's a classic sequel move for sure.
Yep.
Yeah. You'll always, I shouldn't say always, but this is it's something you see very, very often with sequels to games, especially like strategy games like this. The first one is new mechanics and it's linear. And then the second one, they start doing stuff like that to add a little bit of variety, add a little bit of replay value as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other new thing they did is you are no longer just following Orange Star. Every new country you go to, you use the COs from that country. So when you're in Yellow Comet, you're playing Yellow Comet COs. When you're in Green Earth, you're playing Green Earth COs, which I loved because it gave me the opportunity to use all of these characters that I would not have been able to use otherwise because none of my friends had Advance Wars, so I couldn't play multiplayer, because they suck, clearly. And so, it's more replay value. You get to decide not only which missions you want to do in which order, but what COs you want to use for those specific missions. I think that's part of the adding new COs sort of thing, is that now each country has at least 3. So you get a lot of variety with that.
By the way, I wonder who's playing multiplayer in these games. Because when you take your turn, you can take all the time you want.
Correct.
Right? And you're focused on your turn, and that's all well and good. And then when the computer takes their turn, it's instantaneous.
Yes.
All their moves are done. They take virtually no time to think, and then it's back to your turn. But when you're playing multiplayer, the computer no longer is taking their instantaneous turns.
Correct.
You're waiting for your friend to do all their stuff. I don't know who has the patience for that. I never played these games multiplayer.
Yeah.
And I mean, to be fair, I didn't know anybody who I could play, dual strike with, right? It was a very solitary experience.
Yeah.
But like just the thought of kind of sitting there and waiting for your friend to do stuff. And this is before we had cell phones with internet, that were, occupying all of our attention. So there wasn't very much to distract yourself with either.
Yeah.
Other than talking to your friend. And I mean, your friend doesn't want to talk to you. They're focusing on their turn.
Correct.
So yeah, I'd love to know who played these games multiplayer and if it was a rewarding experience.
Yeah, it really seems like you'd have to be dedicated to playing Advance Wars multiplayer. You need to find somebody else with a Game Boy Advance and a copy of Advance Wars. You have to have a link cable, and you have to be willing to sit down for what would probably be, at least like 45 minutes to an hour on a good day.
More than that. Yeah. Like if you figure 45 minutes to an hour is your typical scenario in single player, like you got to add so much more time to that.
Correct.
To allow for the other human to make their decisions, right?
Absolutely. It's basically like if you don't want to play Risk on an actual board game, then you can probably play Advance Wars multiplayer and have a similar experience.
And not to belabor the point, but funnily enough, I actually played Risk a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And with Risk, you have a couple of, it's a very social game in that you're always talking and you're always making alliances. And then the backstabbing happens and people get so bitter and it's all very, it's fantastic. Risk is actually kind of a shitty game, but the social aspect makes it great. And when people are making their moves, they're kind of like making them one at a time. Yeah. And they're using their hands, they're moving. When you're playing Advance Wars, I just don't see how that's as engaging, but that's true.
All right. And so with that, our nice short, sweet look at Advance Wars 2, we're going to take another quick break, and then we'll be back with Advance Wars Dual Strike. Alright, we're back. It's time for Advance Wars DS, or Advance Wars Dual Strike. That was a thing that a lot of DS games were doing for some reason. I don't think I ever understood it, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I don't know, man. It's like, it reminds me of back in the Super Nintendo days when every game was Super this or Super that.
Yeah, or 64, everything.
I get it, guys. I get it. It's a Super Nintendo, all right?
Yeah.
Castlevania 4 is Castlevania 4. I don't know who calls Castlevania 4 Super Castlevania 4. Honestly, it's completely ridiculous.
See, I wonder if that was like a Nintendo mandate, because there's no PS Wipeout. You know what I mean?
Yeah. PS Wipeout. Could you imagine?
Yeah, or like PS Silent Hill PS or something.
Oh, man. I mean, mild credit to Nintendo here in that they didn't call it Advance Wars DS. At least they gave it Dual Strike. So, we got something going on there.
Yeah. Which, I mean, and it does. I mean, it talks about what you should expect in the game. So it's not completely tacked on there. But like I said, third installment in the franchise. US release August 22nd of 2005. EU release September 30th of 2005, and coming in at number 1, the Japanese release in June 23rd of 2005. So the first concurrent Advance Wars release in both the West and Japan, with Japan actually getting the game first.
You know what else kind of amuses me when I think about it? For the first two Advance Wars games, like, I remember reading through gaming magazines, and they'd always have, like, you know, what's coming up from the East, you know, what are the Japanese gamers playing right now? And they'd have, you know, pictures of Fire Emblem for Super Famicom and stuff like that. And I'd be like, oh man, the Japanese are so lucky, blah, blah, blah. I can imagine a Japanese gamer reading Famitsu, and Famitsu's talking about Advance Wars for the GBA, and the Japanese are like, oh my god, the Americans are so lucky. Like, which is something that was just impossible in my mind.
I know,
right?
But that's the thing, right? Because, like, I try to imagine, like, if I was a Japanese, person who played games, like, up to that point, and I had grown up playing Advance Wars or Famicom Wars from, like, 1988 on, I was like, oh, I played this one, I got the Game Boy one, I got the Super Famicom one, and then nothing until 2004. I'd be pissed, like, if I was seeing, the West getting all these Advance Wars games, I'm like, what the fuck?
I'd feel so burnt. I'd be like, fuck you, Nintendo. Like, what's going on here? Why are all these gaijin getting my game?
Exactly, because at least with us, like, we don't even know what we're missing until we actually get one of them, right? Like, you know. I
had no idea. And, you know, I'm a semi-knowledgeable kind of gamer.
Yeah.
I had no idea that there was, like, a Wars series until we were doing research for this one. I always just thought Advance Wars was Advance Wars, and that was that.
Yeah, I knew about the Super Famicom one, but I did not know that it went, like, all the way back to 88. Like, that's insane to me. But, you know, now they finally caught up, and they're good to go. Now they're back on top.
The orange stars aligned.
Exactly. So the development team, this time we have 2 directors, and 2 producers as well. So co-directed by Makoto Shimojo, returning from Advance Wars 2, and Kentaro Nishimura, who worked extensively on Advance Wars and Fire Emblem. Because
shocking development.
All these people were... Sometimes I feel like Intelligent Systems makes 2 games. Now just 1 game.
Yeah.
Now they just make Fire Emblem. And also 2 producers, co-produced by Toru Narihiro. Again, this is his 3rd Advance Wars game at this point. I'm sure he's done more. And Hitoshi Yamagami, who is credited with creating the concept for the Panel de Pon series, which is known in the West as Tetris Attack or Puzzle League. And I just added this because I am a very big fan of, like, complete transitions. Like, if you were... It's kind of like when we were talking about the Resident Evil guy. How am I forgetting this name right now? Shinji Mikami. Yes. Yeah. And it was like, he's previously worked on Goof Troop. And I was like, cool.
But I think, you know what? I think that's definitely the way to go, right?
Yeah.
Because talent is talent. And if you can bring talent with different experience onto your project, bringing you this fresh outlook, I think that's immensely valuable in almost any industry.
Absolutely. But I find it endlessly entertaining forever. So I like the fact that this guy who had worked on probably Pokemon Puzzle League is now working on Advance Wars Dual Strike.
Yeah, that's awesome. Like, just completely different.
Yes. And I'm sure it must be, like, good for them, too, to not be stuck sort of doing the same kind of game over and over again.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Cough, cough, Masahiro Sakurai. Cough, cough.
Oh.
And then music composed by Yoshito Hirano, returning from Advance Wars 2 as well. Again, you know, the story, while I think this is probably the most intriguing story of the 3 Advance Wars game we've talked about so far, it's essentially a continuation of the previous game. Black Hole has returned once again. Dun dun dun. This time, led by the even more Nazi-sounding Von Bolt, after Sturm died at the end of Advance Wars 2. Because that's another thing that happened, is, like, people died in Advance Wars, which is insane to me. So, spoiler alert after that. And Von Bolt is looking to give himself eternal life by absorbing the energy of Omega Land. Again, it's not like Oscar-worthy screenwriting here, but it gets the job done, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just a vehicle for the game.
Exactly. And it does what it sets out to do. So you're getting an additional 9 new commanding officers, and Sturm is not returning, so you get 27 playable commanding officers altogether. Dual Strike sort of was the opposite of Advance Wars 2. I think they saw what people were saying and they were like, okay, you want a new game? I'm going to give you a new game. And then they slapped us over the head with Dual Strike. But basically the Dual Strike comes from the use of 2 concurrent commanding officers during missions. So you're no longer controlling 1 commanding officer, you're controlling at least 2 on every mission. So what that does is it not only gives you buffs and debuffs from each commanding officer, because they each control their own set of units, but it also gives you tag powers, or dual strikes, in addition to their regular commanding officer powers, and superpowers. Basically, it combines both of their CO powers into one giant, awesome sort of move. And again, it sort of does what Advance Wars does. It takes something that already existed and it sort of remixes it to add even more depth and complexity and strategic value to everything you do in the game. And to add to that, obviously, you can select different commanding officers for each mission, so you can experiment with different combinations of powers. And I like that they've also added a thing where certain commanding officers that are played together, their powers sort of bounce off of each other's better. So their powers are more effective overall when used in combination.
Yeah. And certain certain commanding officer pairings will just kind of get like a general power boost in addition to their actual powers. So you'll have, for example, Eagle gets the ability to move twice as his superpower, but when he's paired with certain characters, his units will also get like a 30% power boost or whatever.
Yeah. And so I have to ask you, what do you think of the addition of the tag powers and just the ability to use 2 commanding officers at once? Because that's a huge change.
It is a huge change, yeah. Like it's, it's very subjective, I think. Like it really depends on who you ask. For me, it's, I think overall it was good, right?
Yeah.
And the reason is because it allows, I like being able to break a game.
Yes.
Right? And so some of the CO superpowers and the tag powers are so broken.
Yes.
Like they are so powerful, that a lot of the time you're just kind of building up, you're making incremental moves, and then you slap the computer with a super tag power, and then it's just over, right? So on one hand, it's a lot of fun watching these broken things happen. On the other hand, it does remove a little bit, I found, of the difficulty from the game.
Yeah.
And a little bit of the, I don't want to say strategic depth, but I remember a lot of scenarios where I'm just kind of waiting for the superpower to build up.
Absolutely.
And then destroying.
Yep.
Right? Now, conversely, you are also living in abject fear of the computer's powers.
Correct.
Too. Right?
Yep.
Because like and it depends on the mission, right? Like some COs, I don't give a shit what they do, right? Like they use their superpower, whatever.
Yeah.
But there are some other COs, and when they're computer controlled and they throw out their superpower, it's like, oh my god, I'm about to get wrecked. and so there is like a lot of fear and tension there, which really adds to the game.
Yeah.
So, it really depends on who you ask. Like, do you want your strategy game to have these gigantic haymaker swings, these gigantic shifts in tide, or not? Right? Personally, I kind of see the value in both points of view, but ultimately, what I remember most fondly about Advance Wars is just breaking it, and I loved it.
Nice. Do you have any favorite commanding officer combinations?
Oh yeah, dude. And virtually anything with Colin, but specifically Sasha and Colin was just like absolutely bonkers. Because you have Sasha go first. She kills, like you make as much money with her as you can, because her superpower is that when she does damage, she gains money correspondingly. And then when Colin tags in, he does damage that scales with the amount of money you have. So you have Sasha build up the money, and then Colin, like you can, oh my god, man, when you have enough money with Colin, you can take like a lowly infantry unit and smash a mega tank with it.
That's amazing.
Like, I'm serious. Like, they're just holding their rifles and they walk up to this like 3-story tank and ruin it. and it's hilarious, right? Like, I loved it.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Or the other one too. And I mean, Sasha and Colin, while extremely broken, not as practical.
Yeah.
Eagle and Sammy was probably like the best one in the game.
I have always thought that Eagle's superpower is so ridiculously broken.
Oh my god. It again, like if you want to make the game easy, then you pick Eagle and you compare him with just about anyone. But specifically when you pair him with Sammy, it's ridiculous, right? Because Eagle, his superpower is that he can move twice.
Yes.
And his units get a power boost. And when you pair him with Sammy, the power boost is even bigger. And Sammy has the ability to capture opponent headquarters without waiting.
Yep.
And so you just move all your guys across the map with Eagle, punch a hole through, and then Sammy instantly captures their headquarters, and the map is over.
Yeah. So overall, I love the addition of tag powers because it makes the game so much more entertaining to play. And it really does add, like, Black Hole Rising added some replay ability. I think Dual Strike is kind of meant to be replayed.
Yep.
Like, it's meant to be played more than once because you have so many options that there's no way you're even gonna try all of the different pairings in one playthrough, I don't think.
No. And that's where the other modes help too.
Yeah.
The survival and the combat modes.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can just have like quick hits where you play with these two COs that you've never tried together before, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really just, it's a very well designed game for replay value.
Yeah. And then to add on top of that, the COs that you use in missions gain experience and they eventually get promoted, which promotion, what it does is it lets them access like different skills that improve their specific fighting styles. So that's another thing. Like, the game also rewards you for like having a favorite CO. It's not like it punishes you. Obviously, some COs are better for specific fights, and I think that not all of your COs are available all the time. But there is advantages to sort of finding a combination that works for you and sort of rolling through that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then we get to the second big change. And it was so huge that Paul forgot that it even existed, which is dual front battles. And so this is where the DS's dual screen really comes into play. So up until this point, with your single screen Advance Wars game, you just had the one map to focus on. Dual Strike sort of flips this by having dual front battles. Essentially what this does is it splits your two COs, or your two commanding officers. One of them goes on the top screen, the other one goes on the bottom screen. The one on the top screen just has a set number of units, and they are doing battle with the opposing one of the opposing commanding officers. Whoever wins that battle, their remaining units get sent down to the bottom screen and they join up with the other commanding officer. So the loser of the top battle has to fight the two winners by themselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't remember this at all.
Yeah.
Like, was this in the campaign mode, or
yes.
was it like...
There are some in the campaign mode. And then the other thing is the commanding officers on the bottom, are able to produce units, and they are able to send units up to the top screen, but those units cannot come back until that battle is over. So it's really it's very strategic, because if you lose the top battle, you essentially are doomed, because you have to fight 2 commanding officers by yourself, and you can't use tag powers, and they can.
Yeah.
But if you send too many units to the top fight, you risk not being able to win the bottom fight, and if you lose before the top fight is over, it's over.
Yeah.
So it's really a play on sort of resource management to the extreme. Like, you know, how do I win this top fight? What is a good amount of support that won't doom me on the other side of the battlefield?
Yeah.
So they're very entertaining. The flip side to that is once you win the top fight, you've sort of won the entire thing.
And this is really my only complaint with the game, is that once you know you've won, you still kind of have to go through the motions and actually physically win. Mm-hmm. So so it always adds like another, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes to every single map, where you're kind of just going through the motions and smashing what's left of the computer.
Yes.
And the way a game like Fire Emblem overcomes this is that you get experience, right? So you know you've won the map, but you're still getting XP for killing off all the remaining units and so on and so forth. Advance Wars doesn't do this. Like, you know you've won, but you have to go through the motions of winning. My only complaint with this game.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, because I think that's been a problem since the first game. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Like, and they've never really found a good way to go about it. And it's even worse in missions where, like, you have to win in a specific way. Like, you have to either blow up a certain amount of things, or you have to capture a certain thing. Because sometimes you know you have won, but then you have to trek an infantry unit all the way across the map to capture one specific building to actually win the mission.
Yeah, it's it can be tedious winning when you've already won, especially if it involves infantry, because infantry can only move 3 squares at a time.
Correct.
And if your objective is across the map, it's just a lot of turns of like moving this little dude. And
one other thing that they clearly learned from Advance Wars 2 to Dual Strike is to add more units. They added 7 new units and several new features that add a lot of depth to these battles. And again, it's just the amount of stuff that's in a game like this. So you get the Mega Tank, which is a brand new tank. You get the Pipe Runner. There's Oozium, which is sort of this blob substance that automatically destroys any unit that it touches. So it's very campaign focused unit. The Black Boat, the Aircraft Carrier, which I love. I think the Aircraft Carrier became like my second favorite new unit besides the Stealth Fighter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I love the Stealth Fighter because it's essentially, okay, so I hate boats. I hate naval combat because it sort of comes down to like, are you making a submarine or are you making a battleship? And if you make a battleship, your submarine's going to blow it up. And if you make if you make a submarine, then you're just like trying not to run out of gas, essentially, because you're underwater the whole time.
Yeah.
So the thing I like about Stealth Fighter is it's like, what if we take a submarine and we put it in the sky? Because it can just make itself invisible at the cost of fuel. But I thought the Stealth Fighter was so helpful in sort of breaking a lot of those deadlocks when like you're sort of throwing units at the opponent and you're both sort of taking enough casualties that you have to reload and try again. But the Stealth Fighter is like excellent at like, I need to destroy this specific unit. Let me send the Stealth Fighter and do it and then get out.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I never really thought of it that way, and I don't remember using the Stealth Fighter that much. What I remember the most actually is the Mega Tank.
Yes.
Because every time I built a Mega Tank, I just felt like I couldn't lose. I was like, here's my Mega Tank. I'm slapping it on the table and have fun, guys. Send your infantry at it all day long. It won't make a difference, right? Now, obviously, that's not really true, but I don't know, man. It's just a cool it's just a cool looking unit.
Yeah, it's amazingly very cool design for it. But also I need to recognize the fact that like Advance Wars has like a fascination with just making bigger tanks every game. They're like, first game you had your regular dinky tank and you had your medium tank, and the medium tank was like, this is the shit right here. And then they were like, no, now we've got the Neo tank, which looks like a pig for some reason, but don't worry about it because it wrecks shit. And now they're like, no, now we got the Mega tank. And so I'm concerned. I'm wondering if the reason we haven't seen a new Advance Wars game is because they haven't thought up of a better name than Mega Tank.
That has to be the single largest impediment to the creation of a new Advance Wars.
They're like, the Ultra Tank. And they're like, no, that's not good enough. But yeah, the Mega Tank is fucking awesome. There's also new weather effects. They have a sandstorm, which decreases visibility and attack range for all indirect fire units, which affects literally no one but me because I love rockets.
Oh, dude, rockets are great. You're not the only one. Okay. Don't worry.
Rockets are awesome. I love building a wall of rockets so that when they come to me, I just shoot the crap out of them before they get to me and then run them over with whatever tanks I have. And then you have two brand new modes. You have survival and combat mode. Survival is a non-stop war of attrition. Basically, you're given a limited amount of money, turns, or time, one of either one of these, to complete a series of maps. I've never played survival, but I'm sort of interested in going back and playing it now that I've seen what it's all about. I know you played a little bit of it. What did you think?
I played them all. Survival's really good, in that it's not the campaign, right? Like it's, well, it's true though, right? Like it's more concentrated, and it just, it just gives you different objectives. It forces you to think a little bit differently each time. Yeah. I think it's well worth it. And, did you play combat?
I did not. This is what I was talking about. This is what I was thinking of, when you were saying, like, how do you play Advance Wars multiplayer? And I was like, you make it real time.
Well, combat is, I would call it an amusing diversion. Mm-hmm. Much like out in Resident Evil 3, you had that mode. What was that mode again?
Mercenaries?
Thank you. It's not the quote unquote real game, but it's sort of like an add-on. That's kind of what combat is. It's fun for a little while, but it's not really Advance Wars.
Gotcha. See, the thing is, when I read like this description, like it's real-time Advance Wars and you control your units with the touchpad, I was like, much like this episode, that could be really great, or it could be fucking horrendous. So I'm glad to know that it's not, an abomination.
No. Okay. It's, you know what? It's neither great nor terrible. Yeah. It's something that you can, it's like slot car racing in Yakuza, which you and I were talking about before we started recording, right? It's an interesting little diversion. It's possible perhaps to get a little bit obsessed with it. But ultimately that's not where the meat of the game is. Yeah. Survival mode is Advance Wars. Okay. So if you want more Advance Wars, you play survival mode, or you do like the custom map or whatever other mode it is. Yeah.
And like Advance Wars and Advance Wars 2, Dual Strike received universal praise. 90 out of 100 on Metacritic, 34 out of 40 on Famitsu, 8 out of 10 on Edge, 9 out of 10 Eurogamer. Like, it's sort of, so this is going to sound really weird and like stupid, but I guess it was the comeback story for a series that didn't really need to have a comeback, if that makes any sense. Yep. Like the valley of Advance Wars 2 with its 8 out of 10 scores was quickly rectified by Dual Strike having 9 out of 10 scores. So clearly we avoided the recession that would have been Advance Wars potentially being just good, not amazing.
See, but that's one way to look at it, right? Yeah. But the weird thing about Dual Strike is that it's sold really poorly,
yes.
right? So it sold about half as many units as Advance Wars, I think the original. I think Advance Wars 2 sold even more than the original, now that I remember.
Yeah.
And Advance Wars Dual Strike only sold half as many units as Black Hole Rising.
Yeah.
On a system that was more ubiquitous than the GBA.
That is true.
So it's weird in that Dual Strike, at least for me. And I mean, look, I'm biased, right? 'Cause I didn't play the first two when they were released, but Dual Strike to me is the pinnacle of the series and a fantastic game. The reviews bear that out. And yet in Japan, especially in Japan, the game sold like crap.
Yeah.
And effectively killed the game over there.
Well, this is a thing that I'm wondering, because it doesn't explain the decline in Japan, but I think it does a little bit in America, in that I think Fire Emblem became a bigger series post Game Boy Advance. I think
it did.
I think Shadow Dragon was the big Fire Emblem game. I also think that there was I think once Advance Wars sort of opened the door for strategy RPGs, I think that there were a lot more options outside of Advance Wars to get your strategy RPG fix.
Yes, I agree. Like ironically, the great gift that Advance Wars gave Western gamers is the impetus for Nintendo to release more Fire Emblem games here, right? Because the first Fire Emblem game was also the first, Fire Emblem game released on the Game Boy Advance here in the West. And then they obviously released more of them, right? Like, Fire Emblem wasn't doing too great either. Like, Shadow Dragon was, it was a notable release, but for all intents and purposes, Fire Emblem was pretty much dead too until Awakening.
Yeah.
Once Awakening came around, it sold 1 million units, and we entered this Fire Emblem renaissance that I'm personally very thankful we have. I love those Fire Emblem games. But Advance Wars, not so much. Yeah, Dual Strike was, I think it was like the 301st selling game on the Nintendo DS in Japan.
Yeah.
Like, really incredible. I don't understand how this game didn't get more traction there.
It's weird. I was trying to come up with a good movie comparison and I just couldn't, but Advance War, like Dual Strike is the very refined artsy sequel to the fucking that didn't do well, to the American blockbuster that was Advance Wars 2, which was a box office success, but is not as good. If that makes any sense. Yeah.
No, pretty much. I can't think of any movie analog for that either.
I'm sure somebody will message us. We'll edit our voices like The Godfather 2 versus.
Yeah, but I mean, Dual Strike is no Godfather 3. Come on.
That's true. But it really is it's so weird that what I consider to be the best game in this series is probably the least well known. Yeah. And that happens a lot in video games, that's why you get so many of these really rare, expensive games, because they were sequels on series that people just weren't playing as much of at the time, but they were the best versions of these games. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that with that said, is this the peak of Advance Wars in your opinion? Is this the best it's ever gotten?
Unquestionably. Okay. Yeah. This is, I think, the best game in the series. And you know what? If you ask a Nintendo shareholder, they will disagree with me.
That's true. But with that said, we have one more Advance Wars game to talk about. So after a quick break, we will be right back. Advance Wars Days of Ruin. Here it is. The last entry in the Advance Wars series up to this point.
Oh man, that sounds like sad.
Yes, it is. It is not a fitting epilogue for this series, at least in my opinion. We'll see. So Advance Wars Days of Ruin is the fourth installment in the franchise. It's also known as Dark Conflict in the PAL territories, and I can't tell which title I like the least.
To me, Dark Conflict.
Yes, I think Days of Ruin was the right choice. But again, we're seeing simultaneous releases. Actually, the most simultaneous release for any Advance Wars game, I think, up to this point. The US release was January 21st of 2008, and the EU got it 4 days later in January 25th of 2008. And Japan. Japan had the good sense to cancel this game.
Oh, come on now. We're going to have a fight here on this one. But anyway, please continue.
No, I'm being facetious. So the original Japanese release was canceled, but it was later available for download on the Japanese 3DS eShop on October 30th of 2013, but only as a platinum status reward. Assuming for Club Nintendo members. So quick hits on.
I'm just shaking my head here. Like, why are you oh man. I guess they were more interested in selling Club Nintendo than they were Days of Ruin.
Correct.
So,
that's
anyhow,
what I would
I just
assume.
answered my own question. Please continue.
So quick hits on the development team, co-directed by Daisuke Nakajima, who worked on Dragon Quest Wars, which I did not know was a thing. And now I desperately need in my life. But it's basically what you think. It's Dragon Quest meets Advance Wars. Why don't I have this?
I would love to see that. It's amazing, man. Like you think you know it all, and then bam, Dragon Quest Wars, and it's like, well, my life has been empty so far.
This is, of course, a Japanese only release, I believe. It may have been released in the West in some form, but I'm not sure. And then
I don't know, man.
Co-directed also by Masaki Tawara of Endless Ocean. Co-produced by well-known at this point Toru Narahiro and Hitoshi Yamagami, and again composed by Yoshido Hirano. So, Days of Ruin, a completely new story. So they've scrapped literally everything Advance Wars up to this point. The nations are different, the characters aren't there anymore, and I think this was sort of a pivot to a much darker and more serious tone for the series. You know, like we had said before, Advance Wars is a game about war, but it's a very lighthearted. It's very sort of bright and cheerful in all that entails, even though the subject matter is quite serious. But Days of Ruin takes the opposite approach in making it sort of the grim, dark series that I think you would think of when you think of a game that has the word war in the title. And so I don't know how I feel about this change, but it's very interesting.
You know, it's a weird one because, like, okay, first of all, they had to make the change, right? Dual Strike, amazing game, sold like crap.
Yeah.
Right? So along comes Days of Ruin. They know they're not going to release it in Japan because Dual Strike sold here not very well, but in Japan it was a horrible, horrible failure.
Yeah.
So I think the impetus for the design choices in Days of Ruin was to cater it more towards Western tastes. So you have a less lighthearted art style, although it's still distinctive, still very much Intelligent Systems.
Yeah.
It is a little bit less cartoony, darker palette, browns and grays and blacks, darker story. For me, it was very jarring because I played it, a little while after Dual Strike, and I was kind of expecting more Dual Strike. I hadn't done any reading on Days of Ruin at all. So I loaded it up and I was like, whoa, this is completely different. But once I got over that, then I found, okay, this is enjoyable. I thought the soundtrack was much better.
Yeah.
And I thought the presentation, the story was better too, right? Now, with that said, I never actually finished Days of Ruin. I think I got about halfway through, and I can't remember what happened, but there was something that happened in the game, and I was like, all right, I think I'm done.
Yeah.
How far did you get?
I think I got over halfway. I think I'm currently sitting with maybe like 3 or 4 missions to go. But I also dropped it. And I will say, I do agree that I think the change needed to be made. Or not that it needed to be made, but I think that they thought that it needed to be made based on what had happened with Dual Strike. And I find it ironic that this sort of comes full circle in the sense that when other strategy RPGs were doing big, like drawn out, dark, sort of serious stories, and Advance Wars was doing sort of more lighthearted fare, not focusing as much on the story, more on the mechanics. Now we see Advance Wars sort of come back to the big, sort of more involved, more fleshed out story.
Yeah. It's definitely a departure.
Yeah. And so, for me it was, if it wasn't called Advance Wars, I don't think it would have hurt as much, personally. Because while I do agree that it doesn't do anything terrible, and the story is not bad, I grew to sort of enjoy it as it went on. It's just so different. It's so different from what I'm used to from this series, and change is not good, Paul. I want everything to stay the same forever.
Well, and the changes to the mechanics.
Yes.
I think not an improvement at all.
Yeah. But I think that comes from the fact that Dual Strike, like we said, I think was the peak of what you could do with those mechanics.
Yes.
And so I think it's funny because I think Days of Ruin sort of scales back on what Dual Strike did. I think it for the first time in the series, I think they've sort of made things a little less depth and a little less layered by obviously taking away the dual commanding officer system, which immediately just cuts like any strategic nuance in half, essentially. But also makes it a much more challenging game. Like I think Days of Ruin is the hardest Advance Wars game that I've played.
Yeah, that might very well be so. To be quite frank, I don't remember.
Yeah.
I remember. Well, you know what? It must be because I remember Dual Strike being not terribly difficult at all, and Days of Ruin doesn't have those kind of broken mechanics that do that. So it would have to be harder. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to give a brief overview of the story, Days of Ruin takes place in a post-apocalyptic world, following a meteor shower that essentially destroyed most of the population of the planet. And you are a cadet in the Rubinel 12th Battalion, which is one of the 2 countries that are featured prominently in this game, the other being Lazuria. You are Will. You are Rubinel Cadet Will, who is rescued by the 12th Battalion. You eventually discover an amnesiac girl named Isabella, who turns out to be directly related to the main antagonist of the game, Dr. Calder, who is attempting to use this conflict as an opportunity to conduct his own experiments. It's definitely a much more intriguing story. Definitely much more, like, it gets you more invested in it. And I feel like the missions that they designed for this game are much more closely tied to the story. So, like, when you're doing the missions, it feels like you're a part of the ongoing story. Whereas in the previous Advance Wars games, I felt like the missions were sometimes a little detached from the overall story, if that makes any sense.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, obviously, much darker story, much darker themes. Is it a good thing? I think that it just depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for more Advance Wars, maybe not so much. But if you can learn to sort of go with it and let the game just do what it wants to do, I think that there's something there. Like there's good there. I think that the story as written is serviceable. It's not gonna change your life or anything, but I think that it does what it does well, and it makes it so the game that you're playing is more interesting.
Yeah, and it helps, and there's no way to prepare for this, but it also really helps if you know what the game is ahead of time. Because, like I said, I don't know how it was for you, Arnie, but for me, I had no idea what it was going to be. I just saw new Advance Wars game. And then when I played it, I was slapped in the face. Like, was it like that for you?
Yeah, absolutely. It was weird because I also had no idea. I saw this. I think I bought it at a GameStop, like, because the other thing is, I never played Dual Strike when it initially came out. Like, after Advance Wars 2, I sort of fell off the Advance Wars train. And then I ended up finding Days of Ruin at a local GameStop for like $8. And I was like, I haven't played these games in forever. And it was an itch that I had to scratch, essentially. I was like, I want like a good strategy RPG to play again. And so I popped this in and I was like, immediately like, where's Andy? Where's Olaf? Where's anybody? Where's Eagle? And I was just like, it was just like, I was shell shocked for a second. I was like, well, I guess I gotta figure this out. And I wasn't, it was weird because I saw that the countries were new and stuff, but I still held out hope that at some point, like, the old characters would show up. And then once I got like halfway through, I just like came to the realization that was not gonna happen. Yeah.
It's a little bit sad that way.
Yeah.
But it what can I say? Like, for all these complaints that we have, it was successful for them. Like, it sold much better than Dual Strike did, which is kind of strange to me because I think this is the lesser game, and I think it's commonly held to be the lesser game.
Yeah.
But it definitely did better sales-wise than Dual Strike. Not well enough for them to continue the series, but these changes that we all don't like actually ended up working well for them as a company.
And I mean, in 2008, like, what are we looking at here? We're looking at World War II shooters. We're looking at Gears of War. Like, black, brown, silver was the color palette of the age. So I can't fault them for trying to keep the series alive by sort of pivoting into something that they thought would work, and it did work. It sold more. So that's unarguable that it overall, while the game may have suffered in some ways, they did their damnedest to try to keep the series alive. Now, I will say, and this is not an argument that I think I'll try to, that sort of holds water, but if you want to look at it a certain way, you could say that Advance Wars continued to live on in Battalion Wars for the GameCube, and then Battalion Wars 2 for the Wii. Now, those aren't exactly the same, but they're sort of in the same vein, and they're usually held up to be spiritual successors to Advance Wars.
Yeah, but they're wildly different games.
Yes.
I think they were originally meant, like you said, they were originally meant to be kind of continuations of the series, but the mechanics are so much different.
Yeah.
It's not a strategy game at all. It's more real-time strategy than anything. And even then, your real-time strategy is like, you're controlling one unit and kind of sending orders to others. So the closest thing that it shares with Advance Wars is kind of the aesthetic and the theme. And even the aesthetic is not quite the same.
Yeah. And, to touch on it briefly, mechanically, I know we've talked about the things have changed. So obviously no dual COs, no dual front battles, no tag powers. You do have CO powers, but they're unlocked later in the game, and the way they're used and implemented is different. You have to have a CO unit that goes around the map. It's just basically a more powerful version of a regular unit, and they have a range where they affect several units or debuff other units. So it's different. I mean, you can't accuse them of sort of riding on what Dual Strike was doing. I think it works to a certain degree. I think that, with strategy games, the cardinal sin is sort of not evolving enough, because I think then it just gets stale. But I think they did enough where this definitely feels like its own game. I think one thing that was sort of a problem, or not a problem, but I think one thing that hurts Days of Ruin 2 is that it sort of sits alone on this island when you look at the series. You see these first 3 games that are clearly connected, and then Days of Ruin is sort of the one lone pariah doing its own thing. And the fact that this was the last game in the series up to now doesn't do it any favors in the hearts and minds of Advance Wars fans, I don't think.
No, it feels like Days of Ruin ruined the series, right? Because it's so different. And, they tried something new and it didn't work, and we haven't seen it since. I mean, the fact of the matter is it sold better than Dual Strike. Yep. This is like a common misconception. Mm-hmm. Days of Ruin, they tried to make it more adult and they killed Advance Wars and so on and so forth. Nah, I hate to say it, but Dual Strike was the beginning of the end. Yeah. For as amazing a game as Dual Strike is, it just didn't do the numbers. Yeah. And Days of Ruin was kind of like a last ditch effort that didn't quite make it. Yeah. I also find it very I guess intriguing is not the right word, but it's interesting to me that, because when you talk about Advance Wars, you have to talk about Fire Emblem. I think that it's hard to sort of separate the two because this small company was sort of working on both. And I find it very interesting that whereas Fire Emblem had, like you said, they had the 2 Game Boy Advance games, like Advance Wars. Then they had their DS game, which unlike Advance Wars, I feel like was a step forward for the series, but it's not the pinnacle of what the series is. And then instead of having a second DS game, they went to the 3DS, and that game was amazing. Yeah. Whereas Advance Wars had a second DS game that upticked sales, but just didn't do enough numbers to keep the series alive. And it's interesting that, I don't know if there's something about Fire Emblem that just holds people's attention better, and it makes people more interested in it. But I just find it so interesting that series was sort of able to rally by not really changing too much. Like, obviously there are changes in Awakening, and obviously there's the GameCube game and the Wii game, but I think Fire Emblem was able to sort of maintain its identity through a downturn and eventually rally, whereas Advance Wars, I feel like, changed with Dual Strike and had that problem, and then it changed again with Days of Ruin and was not able to sort of rebound after that. Yeah. Fire Emblem was really in the same boat. Like, I can't overstate this. Fire Emblem was dead at Nintendo. The fact that they gave Awakening the green light was a bit of a kind of a Hail Mary throw. Yeah. And Intelligent Systems threw everything they could into Awakening, fully expecting that it would be the last Fire Emblem game. Yeah. The fact that Awakening was like the perfect game at the perfect time, and now everybody loves Fire Emblem, and that's great. Yeah. But yeah, like, you can't avoid talking about one without talking about the other. And I think the thing that probably sets Fire Emblem apart from Advance Wars is, the visual style. Yeah. Like, we all like our anime characters, but we also like it when the characters have relationships and perhaps a little bit of a deeper story. Yeah. Not that Awakening is like a storytelling titan. It's very basic and very strangely paced. Yeah. But the characters are all super endearing, charmingly written, and, there's the dating sim element to it as well, which can't be overlooked. Yeah. And how do you add a dating sim to Advance Wars? I don't know. Right? That's true. See, the problem is the sales numbers, right? Because Fire Emblem 3 Houses is going to come out soon. Yeah. That's a day one purchase. Oh, that game is going to destroy sales numbers for sure. It has to, right? Like, if Xenoblade Chronicles 2 can sell 1 million units, then Fire Emblem 3 Houses has to top that. Yeah. And that kind of seems to be the magic number. Like, that's what Awakening did. And once Awakening topped 1 million, it's like, oh, okay, let's pump out some more Fire Emblem games. So it's like, I mean, is there hope for a new Advance Wars games? Not if Fire Emblem keeps selling.
Yeah,
like,
I don't.
True. If I'm a Nintendo shareholder, what impetus do I have to have intelligence systems working on anything other than Fire Emblem?
Yep. I completely agree. I think the best we can hope for is the spiritual successors, which I think, is it Tiny Metal is the one that came out on Switch that's supposed to be essentially Advance Wars in 3D.
Yeah, Tiny Metal has its own issues though.
Yeah, which is sad because I want my Advance Wars.
I know. Like, I want to like Tiny Metal.
Yeah.
But like the whole Kickstarter thing.
Yep.
You know how the guy, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, damn it. But yeah, the producer of Tiny Metal basically made Tiny Metal with funds that he procured from a Kickstarter campaign for an entirely different game.
I had heard about this.
Yeah, right. And he of course denies it.
Of course.
But like, dude, those optics look terrible. Like, I mean, he can deny it all he wants, but wow, from the outside looking in,
it's not a good look.
It does not look like he is an innocent person.
Yeah.
We're not going to get into that here. I encourage anybody who's interested in that to look up Tiny Metal and the whole drama behind it. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. But I think you're absolutely right. I think that there is no reason for intelligence systems to sort of go back to the well on Advance Wars. And here's the thing, is we'll always complain about not getting more of a particular series that we like, but Advance Wars has 4 incredibly solid games under its belt. And I think that is a lot more than a lot of series, especially video game series, can say. To have, just a nice compressed lineup of solid games, like 8 to 10 out of 10 games. All 4 of them, including Days of Ruin, I think is solid enough that people should play it. And these games are widely available. None of these are particularly expensive. I think that Dual Strike might be the most, but even that's like a $25 game. So none of these games are going to break the bank for you. So overall, I think that Advance Wars, if we never see another Advance Wars games again, at least we got the ones we did, and they're all pretty good, so you can't really go wrong on whichever one you decide to play.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'll be sad if I don't see the series make a comeback, but I'm good. There are enough games to play, and Advance Wars definitely had its time. I loved it.
Yep. So we salute you, Advance Wars. Thank you for everything you've done. I expect some sort of national anthem to be playing as I'm saying these words.
We'll have a bugle horn.
Exactly. A sad, funeral procession. All right. So with that said, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, Paul, for joining me on this exploration.
My pleasure, sir.
As always, if you like what we do, please check us out on iTunes, review, rate us. It's the best way for people to find out about us. I know it's annoying, but please do it. Please. And, if you are on any other social media platform, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, come follow us. Just grab 2 Bud Lights, crack them open, chug them, and then Stone Cold Stunner that subscribe button. I'm gonna keep this going.
Treat it like Vince McMahon.
Yeah, this is gonna be a continuing series for me where I describe ever more complicated wrestling moves to perform on subscribe buttons.
Can't wait till we bust out the ladders.
Yeah, I was gonna say put it in a sharpshooter like Bret Hart did to Shawn Michaels before Vince McMahon stole the title from him.
Oh my god. Oh my goodness, deep cuts.
But yes, please subscribe to us. Check us out on everything. Paul, where can people find you?
Instagram, Pauls_game room.
Perfect. And you can find me on Instagram as well, at Region Free Gamers. We're always doing stuff over there, and we love when people come talk to us. Just hit us up, shoot us a DM. Let us know what you think of this episode, any other episode, what you want to see on the show in the future. But again, thank you so much for listening, guys. Have a good one.